Nathaniel Hayes leaned back in his leather chair, gazing out at the glittering skyline of Crestwood City. The lights of the metropolis reflected his achievements, decades of relentless work, two multi-billion-dollar ventures, and a reputation as a tech magnate who could turn ideas into empires. Yet, in the vast expanse of his penthouse, he felt a hollowness he couldn't ignore. The echoes of his two failed marriages whispered in the silence, reminding him of the cost of vulnerability. Love, he had concluded, was a fragile illusion. People came into his life with promises of forever, only to leave when the cracks in his facade began to show. But Nathaniel was pragmatic. He didn't need love. He needed legacy. His wealth, his power. It all meant nothing without someone to inherit it. An heir was his solution. One evening, after yet another charity gala where couples paraded their perfect families, Nathaniel made a decision. He didn't want the entanglements of a relationship or the messiness of shared custody. What he needed was an arrangement clinical, straightforward, and devoid of emotional complications. The next morning, Nathaniel's assistant, Evelyn, found him deep in thought. "Evelyn," he said, his voice steady, "find me a lawyer who specializes in surrogacy contracts. I want this handled discreetly." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him. She was used to his precision and his unorthodox methods. As the wheels were set in motion, Nathaniel felt a glimmer of control returning. Little did he know that his carefully laid plans would soon take a turn he never anticipated. It was a crisp autumn evening when Nathaniel's path crossed Clara Dawson's for the first time. He was driving through Crestwood's quieter streets, seeking solace after a long day of meetings. The city's bustle faded as he entered a less affluent part of town, where life moved slower, and the streets told stories of struggle. There, on the edge of a narrow sidewalk, sat a young woman. Clara's auburn hair fell in loose waves around her face as she hunched over a scrap of paper, sketching furiously with a worn pencil. Her clothes were tattered but clean, and her green eyes held a determination that defied her circumstances. Nathaniel's car slowed involuntarily as he watched her. Something about her resilience caught his attention. She wasn't begging for change or looking lost. She was creating, as though the world around her didn't exist. For a man who valued purpose above all else, her focus intrigued him. Against his better judgment, Nathaniel turned the car around. Pulling up beside her, he rolled down the window. "What are you drawing?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Clara looked up, startled but not afraid. She studied him for a moment, as though trying to gauge his intentions. "It's just a sketch," she replied, holding up the paper. The image was rough but undeniably beautiful. A tree reaching toward the sky, its branches intertwined with stars. Nathaniel stepped out of the car, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her worn jeans. "Do you sell your work?" he asked, handing her a business card before she could respond. Clara hesitated, her instincts warning her against the polished stranger. But desperation gnawed at her resolve. "Sometimes," she admitted cautiously. Nathaniel nodded. "I have a proposition for you. No strings attached. Just consider it." Before she could protest, he returned to his car and drove away. Clara stared at the card in her hand. The name Nathaniel Hayes meant nothing to her, but the words beneath it, Hayes Tech Enterprises, hinted at wealth and power. That night, as Clara curled up in her makeshift shelter, the memory of the man's piercing gray eyes lingered. She knew she had nothing to lose, but the weight of his offer unsettled her. What kind of man approached a stranger on the street with a proposition? And why had he chosen her? The next morning, Clara Dawson found herself standing in front of the towering skyscraper of Hayes Tech Enterprises. The building gleamed under the sunlight, its glass facade reflecting the sky like a fortress of ambition. Clutching Nathaniel Hayes' business card tightly, she hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn away, but the hunger in her stomach and the cold bite of the night before reminded her that she couldn't afford pride. Inside, the receptionist greeted her with professional detachment. "Do you have an appointment?" "I was told to come," Clara said, her voice wavering. She handed over the card, and the receptionist's demeanor shifted subtly as she recognized the name. Minutes later, Clara found herself in an elevator rising to the top floor. The doors opened to reveal Nathaniel's expansive office, an immaculate space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Crestwood City. Behind a sleek desk sat Nathaniel, his expression unreadable as he gestured for her to sit. "I'm glad you came," he began. "Let me be direct. I need someone to carry my child. I'm offering financial security, housing, and every resource you could need during the process. In return, you'll have no legal claim to the child once they're born." Clara's breath caught. She had imagined many things, perhaps a job offer, maybe even charity, but this? She stared at him, searching for a hint of cruelty or malice. But his tone remained coldly pragmatic. "Why me?" she finally asked. Nathaniel leaned back, his gaze steady. "Because you seem resilient. You've survived adversity, and that says something about your character. This is a business arrangement, Miss Dawson. Nothing more." He handed her a thick contract, its legal jargon outlining every detail of the agreement. Clara's eyes skimmed the pages. A generous financial sum, a fully furnished residence, medical care, and an exit clause stipulating her departure after the child's birth. This is a lot to take in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take your time," Nathaniel replied, his tone devoid of warmth. "Think it over, and come back with your decision." Clara left the office, the contract weighing heavily in her bag. That night, she read it by the dim light of a street lamp, her emotions a storm of doubt, hope, and fear. The promise of stability was tempting, but the thought of giving up a child, a part of herself, was almost unbearable. After a sleepless night, Clara made her decision. She returned to Nathaniel's office the next day, her expression resolute. "I'll do it," she said, sliding the signed contract across the desk. Nathaniel nodded, his face a mask of professionalism. "You've made the right choice," he said, though Clara couldn't tell if he truly believed it. Clara's new life began the moment she stepped into the car waiting for her outside. Hayes, Tech Evelyn, Nathaniel's efficient assistant, greeted her with a polite smile and informed her of the arrangements. The drive to the estate took over an hour, winding through lush countryside before arriving at a sprawling mansion surrounded by manicured gardens. The house was grand yet impersonal, its vastness amplifying the sense of isolation. "This will be your home for the next year," Evelyn explained, showing Clara to a luxurious suite complete with a private bathroom, sitting area, and a walk-in closet already filled with new clothes. "If you need anything, let me know. Mr. Hayes prefers to keep things structured." Clara nodded, overwhelmed by the opulence. The mansion was everything she had never known: comfort, security, and luxury, but it lacked warmth. Even the staff moved silently, their presence almost ghostly. Nathaniel remained distant, delegating all interactions to Evelyn and the team of doctors, nutritionists, and housekeepers he had hired to ensure Clara's well-being. Weekly appointments confirmed the pregnancy's progress, and every detail of Clara's health was meticulously monitored. Despite the comforts, Clara felt trapped. The isolation gnawed at her, and the transactional nature of her new reality weighed heavily on her heart. She spent hours wandering the estate's gardens, sketching to fill the void. One evening, as she sat by a fountain, pencil in hand, Nathaniel appeared unexpectedly. He stood silently for a moment, watching her work. "You seem restless," he observed, his voice breaking the stillness. Clara looked up, startled. "I didn't think you noticed." "I notice everything," he replied, though his tone lacked the warmth of genuine concern. "Are the accommodations not to your liking?" "They're fine," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But this place feels like a gilded cage." Nathaniel's expression flickered, a brief crack in his stoic mask. Without responding, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara to wonder if he had understood her at all. It was in that moment that Clara realized her journey was just beginning, and that beneath Nathaniel's cold exterior lay complexities she had yet to uncover. As weeks turned into months, Clara settled into her new life at the estate, though it was far from comfortable. The routine was rigid, her interactions limited to the staff and doctors who came and went. Nathaniel Hayes remained a distant figure. His presence felt more in the strict schedules and protocols than in the flesh. But fate had other plans for their relationship. One morning, Clara decided to escape the confines of her suite and wandered into the estate's expansive garden. With her sketchbook in hand, she found a quiet spot under a weeping willow. The air was crisp, and the sound of birdsong provided a rare sense of calm. She lost herself in her work, the lines of her drawing weaving together the serenity of the scene before her. She didn't notice Nathaniel approach until his shadow fell across her sketchbook. Startled, she looked up to find him studying her with a curious intensity. "You're talented," he remarked, his tone softer than she had heard before. Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said, her voice cautious. "It helps pass the time." Nathaniel lingered, his gaze shifting from her drawing to the distant horizon. "Do you miss your old life?" he asked unexpectedly. The question caught Clara off guard. She considered lying, but decided against it. "I miss the freedom," she admitted, even if it came with struggle. Nathaniel seemed to consider her words carefully. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Clara wondering what had prompted his rare moment of vulnerability. Later that evening, Clara returned to her suite to find a surprise waiting for her. A high-quality sketchbook and an array of professional pencils. A small note was tucked inside. "For your freedom, in the ways I can offer it." The gesture touched Clara more than she expected. For the first time, Nathaniel had shown a flicker of humanity, and it shifted something in their dynamic. Their interactions became more frequent, though still guarded. Clara's straightforward nature often clashed with Nathaniel's calculated demeanor, but each conversation chipped away at the walls they had built around themselves. Months later, the first major medical milestone arrived. Clara was scheduled for a routine checkup with one of the city's top obstetricians, a visit Nathaniel insisted on attending. It was the first time he had accompanied her to an appointment, and his presence felt both reassuring and intimidating. The doctor conducted the examination with practiced efficiency, pointing out details on the ultrasound screen. Clara watched in awe as the flickering heartbeat of her child filled the room, a sound that seemed to echo in her very soul. Nathaniel, standing stiffly by her side, appeared unmoved at first. But as the doctor explained the progress, his steely composure faltered. For a man who thrived on control, hearing the heartbeat of his unborn child stirred something he couldn't quite name. Then came the unexpected twist. "I have some news," the doctor began, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You're not just expecting one baby, you're having twins." The room fell silent as the words sank in. Clara's eyes widened, her mind racing with the implications. She turned to Nathaniel, whose expression shifted from disbelief to something more profound. Perhaps awe, perhaps fear. "Twins," he repeated, as though testing the word on his tongue. Clara managed a small smile. "Double the responsibility." Nathaniel nodded, though his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. The revelation introduced a complexity neither of them had anticipated, and it deepened the fragile bond forming between them. On the drive back to the estate, Clara couldn't help but steal glances at Nathaniel. He seemed lost in thought, his usual stoic mask slipping. When they arrived, he surprised her by helping her out of the car, a simple act of kindness that felt monumental in its rarity. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she placed her hands over her growing belly and whispered softly, "You two are already changing everything." And in his own suite, Nathaniel stared at the ceiling, wondering if the twins were not only altering Clara's world, but also his own. The revelation of twins brought subtle, yet undeniable changes to the dynamics in the household. Nathaniel Hayes, once a distant and unyielding figure, began to show cracks in his icy exterior. He started appearing in places Clara least expected, joining her for breakfast in the sunlit dining room or pausing in the hallway to ask how she was feeling. His presence, though still reserved, became less like a ghost and more like a man genuinely curious about the life growing inside her. At first, Clara met his overtures with suspicion. Why now? Why the sudden warmth when he had been so cold and calculated before? She guarded herself, responding to his questions with measured politeness, but keeping her emotions tightly in check. One afternoon, as she rested in the living room with her sketchbook, Nathaniel entered and hovered near the doorway. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "What are you working on?" he asked, nodding toward the page in her lap. Clara held up the sketch, an unfinished drawing of the estate's garden. "It's not much yet," she said, her tone neutral. Nathaniel approached, his expression softening as he examined the intricate lines. "You have an eye for detail," he remarked. "It's impressive." Clara looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," she replied, her defenses lowering slightly. He lingered, as though debating whether to say more. Finally, he gestured toward a nearby chair. "May I?" Clara nodded, unsure of what to expect. Nathaniel sat, his usual air of authority tempered by an uncharacteristic hesitancy. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor, "about what it means to be a father. It's uncharted territory for me." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." The hint of sarcasm made him chuckle, a rare, genuine sound that caught her off guard. "I deserve that," he admitted. "But I'm trying. These twins, they've made me question things I thought I had settled long ago." The conversation marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, Nathaniel's gestures of care became more intentional. He accompanied Clara on walks around the estate, asked about her interests, and even joined her for meals, something he had never done before. For Clara, the change was both comforting and unnerving. She couldn't shake the feeling that Nathaniel's growing warmth was tied to his sense of duty rather than genuine affection. Yet, as they spent more time together, she began to see glimpses of a man struggling to reconcile his calculated nature with the emotions he couldn't suppress. The months passed quickly, the approaching due date looming over both Clara and Nathaniel. Despite their progress in building a tentative rapport, the transactional nature of their arrangement still lingered in the background, a shadow neither could fully escape. When Clara went into labor late one night, the calm routine of the estate dissolved into chaos. Nathaniel, usually composed in the face of any crisis, found himself utterly unprepared. He insisted on accompanying Clara to the hospital, pacing the floor of the delivery room as she endured the grueling process. "Stay still, or get out," Clara snapped between contractions, her frustration cutting through the haze of pain. Nathaniel froze, then surprised both of them by taking her hand. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, his grip steady. The hours dragged on, each moment testing Clara's strength and Nathaniel's resolve. Finally, the cries of a newborn filled the room, followed by a second. The twins, a boy and a girl, arrived healthy and strong, their tiny forms swaddled and placed in Clara's arms. Nathaniel stood at her side, his expression unreadable as he gazed down at his children. For a man who had built his life on control and precision, the sight of his newborns was overwhelming. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the boy's cheek. "They're perfect," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Clara, exhausted but glowing, looked up at him. "They are," she agreed softly. For the first time, the distance between them seemed to vanish. In that moment, they were not a billionaire and a surrogate, but two people connected by the miracle of life. As the nurses took the twins for their first checkup, Clara watched Nathaniel closely. He seemed lost in thought, his usual sharp demeanor replaced by something almost vulnerable. "You're going to be a good father," she said quietly. He turned to her, startled. "You think so?" "I do," she replied, her words carrying a weight of sincerity he couldn't ignore. Nathaniel didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope, for the twins, for Clara, and for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. After the twins were born, the days at the estate took on a new rhythm, filled with the sounds of newborn cries and the soft coos of Clara as she soothed them. For Clara, those first weeks were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. She had fallen deeply in love with the twins, James, the boy with a quiet demeanor, and Lila, the girl with a fierce cry that could silence the room. Nathaniel, to Clara's surprise, immersed himself in fatherhood. He was clumsy at first, struggling with diaper changes, hesitating to hold the babies too tightly, but his effort was genuine. Clara often caught him staring at the twins with a look that bordered on wonder. Despite the growing bond between them and their children, the contract loomed like a dark cloud. Clara knew the terms all too well. Once the babies were born, her role would end. She would leave, her connection to the twins severed by legal boundaries she had agreed to months ago. As the weeks passed, the impending separation weighed heavily on her. Packing her belongings felt like preparing for a funeral. Each folded shirt and zipped suitcase a painful reminder of what she would lose. Every moment with the twins, every sleepy smile, every tiny hand wrapped around her finger made her heart ache. Nathaniel, noticing her uncharacteristic quietness, approached her one evening as she stood in the nursery, gazing at the sleeping babies. "You've been distant," he said softly. Clara didn't turn to face him. "I'm leaving soon. It's difficult to ignore." The weight of her words seemed to hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He stepped closer, his voice unsteady. "Do you really want to go?" Clara finally looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Do you think I could walk away from them and feel whole? But we made a deal. You made it clear this wasn't supposed to be personal." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Then, without warning, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, the contract. In one swift motion, he tore it in half, the sound sharp and final. Clara gasped. "What are you doing?" "I made a mistake," he said, his voice firm. "I thought I could keep this purely transactional, but I can't. Not anymore. Stay, Clara. Not because of a deal, but because we need you. Because I need you." Clara stared at him, her emotions a storm she couldn't control. Finally, she whispered, "Do you mean that?" Nathaniel nodded, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Yes." Nathaniel's decision to tear up the contract marked the beginning of a new chapter for them. But it wasn't without challenges. Trust, fragile and tentative, had to be rebuilt between them. Clara stayed at the estate, but their relationship remained undefined, a mix of co-parenting, growing affection, and lingering uncertainties. Nathaniel threw himself into fatherhood with newfound purpose. He was there for late-night feedings, diaper changes, and even the twins' first smiles. Clara watched him transform before her eyes, his once cold demeanor replaced by warmth and dedication. But as much as Nathaniel changed, Clara found herself questioning his motives. Was his desire for her to stay rooted in genuine feelings? Or was it simply convenience, an extension of his desire for control? One evening, as they sat together in the living room after putting the twins to bed, Clara decided to confront her doubts. "You've been different," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. Nathaniel looked up from the book he was pretending to read. "Different how?" "You've opened up more, but I can't help wondering. Why now? What changed?" Nathaniel set the book aside and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "When I first approached you, I thought I could keep emotions out of this. That was the plan, wasn't it? But the twins, they've changed everything. And you've changed everything." Clara's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I need to know this isn't just about the twins. That you're not just keeping me here because it's easier than letting me go." Nathaniel met her gaze, his expression earnest. "It's not about convenience, Clara. I've seen how you've cared for them, how you've brought life to this house. You've shown me a kind of love I didn't think I was capable of. This isn't just about them. It's about you." Clara's breath caught at his words. She wanted to believe him, but years of guarding her heart made her cautious. "If that's true," she said quietly, "then we'll need more than words. We'll need time." Nathaniel nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Then I'll give you all the time you need." Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they began to build something new, something fragile, yet full of promise. Months passed, and the mansion that once felt cold and transactional was now alive with laughter and warmth. The twins, James and Lila, were growing fast, filling their parents' days with joy and challenges. Nathaniel and Clara had settled into a steady rhythm of co-parenting. Their partnership, once defined by a rigid contract, had evolved into something far deeper. Nathaniel, a man who had once prided himself on his emotional detachment, found himself looking forward to moments with Clara. Whether it was sharing a quiet evening after the twins were asleep or watching her draw in the garden, her presence had become his anchor. One evening, As the golden hues of sunset bathed the estate's garden, Nathaniel found Clara sketching beneath a sprawling oak tree. The twins were napping in their bassinets nearby, and the air was filled with the gentle hum of crickets. Nathaniel approached with a nervous energy that was uncharacteristic of him. In his hand, he held a small velvet box. Clara looked up, smiling as she noticed him. "You're awfully quiet," she teased. "What's on your mind?" Nathaniel sat beside her, his usually sharp gaze softened. "You," he admitted, "and everything you've done for this family. For me." Clara's cheeks flushed, but she kept her focus on her sketch. "I didn't do anything special," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. Nathaniel reached out, gently taking the sketchbook from her hands. "You've done more than you realize," he said. "You gave me James and Lila. But more than that, you gave me a reason to believe in love again." Clara's breath caught as he opened the velvet box, revealing a delicate ring set with a single, sparkling diamond. "Clara," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Will you marry me? Not because of the twins or because it's expected, but because I've fallen in love with you. Completely." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent so long doubting his intentions, protecting her heart from disappointment, that she hadn't allowed herself to dream of this moment. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll marry you." Nathaniel slipped the ring on her finger, his hand surprisingly steady. As their lips met in a tender kiss, the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the promise of a shared future. Nathaniel and Clara's wedding was a simple yet elegant affair, held in the garden where he had proposed. The twins were at the center of it all, James in a tiny suit, Lila in a frilly dress, both stealing the hearts of the small group of attendees. Clara's closest friends and Nathaniel's assistant, Clara, were among the guests, their smiles reflecting the joy of the occasion. For Nathaniel, the ceremony was transformative. Standing beside Clara, holding her hand as they exchanged vows, he realized how far he had come from the man who had once viewed relationships as burdens. Now, he was a husband and a father, roles he had never imagined would bring him so much fulfillment. Life after the wedding settled into a beautiful rhythm. Clara continued her art, her sketches now filled with scenes of the twins and moments from their daily lives. Nathaniel balanced his business with family life, finding joy in the chaos of raising two energetic children. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching James and Lila toddle around the garden, Clara turned to Nathaniel. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice soft. Nathaniel smiled, reaching for her hand. "For the first time in my life, I truly am." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her heart full. The journey that had begun with a cold contract had led them to a life neither could have imagined. A life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future they would build together. In that moment, surrounded by the sounds of their children's laughter and the warmth of their shared bond, Clara and Nathaniel knew they had found their forever home. Years passed, and the mansion that had once felt like a place of cold calculations became a sanctuary of love and laughter. James and Lila grew into bright, curious children, their days filled with adventures, learning, and the unwavering support of their parents. Clara's art blossomed, her paintings and sketches now celebrated in galleries, capturing the essence of the life she and Nathaniel had built together. Nathaniel, too, had changed in ways he never imagined. The man who had once believed that success and power were the ultimate goals now found his greatest joy in the simple, beautiful moments with his family. Together, they had created a legacy that was not defined by wealth or status, but by the deep, unbreakable bonds of love. One evening, as the sun set behind the estate, Clara stood in the garden, watching James and Lila chase each other through the rows of flowers, their laughter echoing in the air. Nathaniel joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "You were right," he said quietly. "Love wasn't just an illusion." Clara smiled, her heart full. "No, it wasn't. And now, we have everything we need." They stood together, watching their children, knowing that the future was theirs to shape. A future built on love, trust, and the promise that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. And in that quiet moment, they both understood that the true legacy they had created wasn't in the wealth they had amassed, but in the family they had forged, a family that had changed everything. Thank you so much for sticking with us and following the story all the way to the end. We hope you enjoyed the journey of Nathaniel and Clara, and that it brought you moments of emotion and excitement. If you like this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss out on more engaging stories in the future. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.